Welcome to week 2, Studying the Family. When we're studying the family, we are trying to think critically about marriage and the family. To do that, we want to be objective in our consideration of different forms of family lifestyle. We do not want to come from the lens that because a certain family lifestyle is different from our own, that it is somehow abnormal. Unfortunately, our values around what makes successful families can often bring us to that sort of conclusion. And that's simply because we're using our own lens to look at families rather than trying to come to look at families objectively. There's been a lot of research around families, and they have dispelled many common stereotypes about marriage and families. What's presented here on the screen is certainly not all of the myths that have been dispelled through this research, but it is some of them. You can take a look at these. You've probably heard these myths at some point or another, and there's much research out there proving that none of these myths are in fact true. Family is one of our social institutions. This is not all of the social institutions. This is some of them. When we're talking about a social institution, we're looking at social practices of groups that become familiar, accepted, and expected. It refers to an organized practice and relationships within society, not the physical spaces themselves. So when we're talking about education as a social institution, we're not talking about the physical school building. We're talking about the practices, relationships, hierarchies, ways of being, ways of knowing that go on within that space. So social institutions aren't about physical spaces at all. When we're trying to look at family sociologically, often we do a historical comparison. An issue with that is we often fall prey to nostalgia, which is something we commonly do here in the United States. We want to look back on previous times with nostalgia and think of them as the good old days. Sometimes we can come at it from a cross-cultural comparison lens. For example, looking at family values around the world. That would be an example of that. We can also look at family today, the ideal versus the real. There are lots of different philosophies or frameworks from which you can come to look at the family from a scientific viewpoint. One is the positivist view. This is the idea that there's a valid universal knowledge out there, and that if you can just understand the world well enough, you can get at this ultimate truth and predict it and control it. So the goals of the positivist lens is explanation and prediction of family events. The interpretive view believes that knowledge is gained through interpreting meaning. So the goals there are understanding and empathy. There's a critical view, this idea that truth is imposed by those with the power to shape knowledge. The goals there would be emancipation and empowerment of oppressed groups. Lots of researchers in the family realm come from a demographic perspective, which is the study of how family behavior and household structures contribute to larger population processes. Another term that you want to know, it's not a philosophy, it's just a term that's important for you to know as we go through this, is the idea of the cohort. A cohort refers to a group of people who experience an event together at the same point in time. You may have heard this term already in schools. We often refer to a group of students in the same grade at the same school as a cohort. Okay. In that situation, we usually say like an age cohort, but it's the same sort of concept. Folks who are in the same sort of space phase of time together, they experience some event together at the same time. Why are theories and research important in our everyday lives? Because number one, what we don't know can hurt us. Number two, theories and research help us understand and explain ourselves and our families. And number three, they assist us in engaging in critical thinking and informed decision making. When we're talking about theoretical frameworks, we're actually talking about a set of interrelated principles designed to explain particular phenomenon and to provide a point of view. It's typically a set of statements that try to explain why a phenomenon occurs. So people have gathered some data, they're trying to look at some kind of phenomenon, they're trying to figure out why that phenomenon is happening. As I mentioned before, big issue when you're looking at any sort of intimate relationships is that you are tempted to come at the topic from the lens that your experience is normal, using your own experience as a yardstick to measure things. That is not only not productive, it's actually not realistic at all. When we're trying to get a sample to look at any topic, any social phenomenon, any issue, we are trying to draw a sample group of people who represent the population under study. Okay, so if I'm trying to look at something the family's doing, then I'm trying to look at groups of people who are part of families, which, is pretty much everybody. There's two kinds of samples that I may be trying to get, and it sort of depends on what my goals are. So the first one is a representative sample. And most studies actually are going to try to get a representative sample. And what that means is I want my sample, my group that is drawn from this larger population, to be reflective of that larger population. So let's say I'm trying to look at families in the United States. I'm not going to talk to every single family in the United States. That's not possible. But I do want the group of folks that I talk to have the same sort of characteristics as the larger population, just a smaller group of them. So, I want them to have the same sort of age distribution, the same sort of racial distribution, education, et cetera, et cetera. I want them to reflect that larger population of the United States. But sometimes I may be drawing a sample that is what we call purposive. So I'll give you an example. I ran a study on women who are assumed to be heterosexual because they're married or they're living with a man, but they're secretly seeking out same-sex sexual encounters online. Well, I'm not going to get a representative sample because I'm not looking at all women in relationships across the United States. I'm looking at women who are doing this very specific behavior. It's going to be a small group, right? Relatively small anyway. I mean, it's actually more common than you think, but we're not talking about the entirety of the United States. So I'm only looking at folks who are participating in this behavior. I'm not talking to any woman who's in a relationship. I'm talking only to women who are doing this specific behavior. So I'm trying to get a very purposive sample. And that sample likely is not going to be representative of larger patterns in the United States. And that's okay, because that's not what I'm trying to accomplish. Now, if I'm trying to do any kind of research, not just family research, I have to get my research approved. Excuse me, if I'm expecting to publish the research in a peer-reviewed journal, then I have to get my research approved before I participate in it. And that's the big thing that separates research done by, let's say, a professor, a researcher at a university, et cetera, from some foundation or organization or something like that. So when we're reading research and we see that research has been put out by some organization, some think tank, some foundation or something like that, we need to be very skeptical about looking at that research, because they're not, there's no oversight there. There's no one overseeing that research to make sure that it's meeting the standards or that it's not biased in its collection, et cetera, et cetera. And more often than not, research that comes out of those foundations is very much biased because there isn't anyone overlooking what they're doing. But if I'm planning to publish my research in a peer-reviewed journal, and a peer-reviewed journal means I submit an article, it's blind, the people reading it don't know who wrote it, the reviewers reading it, I don't know them, they don't know me, I don't know who the reviewers are, they don't know that I wrote it. They're reading over the work and giving their feedback about how valid or legitimate they believe my work to be, and you may have to make changes because of that, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these points of oversight, so that you're not just putting out fake research or something to that effect. Okay, so if I want it to be in these peer-reviewed journals, I have to go through this review process. If I work at a university, all universities that get federal funding have what we call the Institutional Review Board, which we call IRB for short. The IRB is not one static panel of folks. It is a group of folks. And, so like, let's say I'm going to do a study and I put my proposal in, I get a group of 5 people this time. The next time I put something in, I may get a different group of 5 people. Each time it's a different group. So when I put my proposal into the IRB folks, they're going to review my research proposal, and one of 3 things is going to happen. Either they're just going to straight out deny the proposal. I personally never had that happen, but I do know people it has happened to. The proposal is just blanketly approved. That doesn't happen very often. More likely than not, it's going to come back with suggested changes. You revise it, resubmit it, put it back through. It may come back again. I've had stuff that's went through the send back with suggested changes and I resubmit it thing like, half a dozen times or so. That's really not uncommon at all. Sometimes the changes are to the protocol itself. Sometimes it's, we don't want you to provide incentives, or we think it's too much, or it could be anything. The Institutional Review Board is made up of all kinds of different folks. Interestingly enough, they're not researchers themselves. They can be, but they don't have to be, I guess is really what I should be saying. Like I met a rabbi once who told me he was on the Institutional Review Board. And at first I was kind of like, why? That doesn't make any sense. But it does if you think about the purpose. The purpose is to make sure that the researcher is not putting their participants in any sort of danger. Is to make sure that they're not doing something unethical. They're not gonna take advantage of their participants or bring harm to them, psychological, physical, or otherwise. So it kind of makes sense that there would be some folks who are not researchers on the board as well. The reason for the IRB has to do with a bunch of studies, rather famous studies now, that people were pretty upset about the research methodology for the study, and people believed it to be unethical. And that's why we now have all of this oversight for researchers, so that you don't end up doing something like this. You don't get so enamored with whatever it is you're trying to find out or accomplish that you end up harming the people who are participating. One such example, not the only one, but one example is the Tuskegee syphilis study. This project ran between 1932 and 1972, so 40 years. It was run by the U.S. Public Health Service. And what they were trying to do was look at the long-term effects of syphilis on the body. Well, if I want to look at the long-term effects of syphilis on the body, what is the one thing that I have to be able to look at that? I have to have people who not only have syphilis, but continue to have syphilis. And that's exactly what happened. They had all their participants had syphilis. The researchers never told them that they had syphilis. They didn't even know what the study was for. They must have thought it was for something else. And they were never treated for syphilis. So many of the men in the study died. Many of them gave syphilis to people in their household, their wives, etc. And they died not even knowing that they had syphilis. What made this even worse is that this particular study, all the men in the study were also African American. Now, a study like this would never, ever get approved today through IRB. There's absolutely no way something like this would get approved. But at the time that this study was being run, there was no such thing as an IRB. There was no oversight. Okay, but it's studies like this that have created the need for an IRB's process. Another example of a study that led people to say, hey, we really need somebody to be watching what these researchers are doing, would be a study widely known as the Tea Room Study, TEA Room Study, by a fellow named Humphreys, who was a sociologist. So this study focused on a previously unstudied but widespread interaction, which was public bathroom sex between men. And it cast new lights on the struggles of men who were forced to keep their sexual encounters secret. The study found that these men had otherwise normal lives and were participating in this behavior to protect their families and careers. Okay. Um, the study resulted in a book. It's actually called The Tea Room Trade. It's still in print if you're at all interested in reading it. The study did accomplish some very positive things, but there are a lot of issues with the methodology, and we're going to talk about those here. So, The Tea Room Trade, Impersonal Sex in Public Places by Laud Humphreys. Humphreys ended up arguing that persecution against gay lifestyles caused men to live anguished lives where they resort to secret and dangerous activities to meet their needs. And you got to remember, this predates the onset of AIDS. Okay, at this point, we don't know that AIDS is a thing. We don't know anything about this. Okay, but there's a lot of negativity around gay lifestyles. People have to stay in the closet. They can lose their jobs. They can lose pretty much everything. So he finds out that there are these certain bathrooms, these certain public bathrooms where men are meeting up to have sex. And so he decides, hey, I'm going to investigate this and see what's going on. Now, this is before the internet, right? So it's not like he can put out a call over the internet. It's not like he can put up a flyer, because this is this secret behavior that people are engaging in, and they don't want to be found out. Okay. So he goes to the bathroom and observes men having sex. He observes these same-sex encounters as a voyeur. He then leaves the bathroom, follows the men to their cars, and writes down their license plates numbers. He has a friend who works at the DMV, so he gets their addresses from the DMV and goes to their homes. He wears a disguise, mustache, glasses, etc. Never identifies himself or the purpose of why he's there. Instead, he poses as a researcher for a health service study. He spoke to both the men and their wives and didn't get any informed consent from any of them. Now, let's stop here a second and talk about informed consent. If I am running some kind of study, I have to have a document we call the informed consent that I give my participants that explains, I'm Alicia Walker. This is where I work. This is what I'm studying. This is the scope of the study. I'm going to talk to X number of people between the ages of this and this. I'm talking to folks and families, or I'm talking to people who do this or people who do that. What is going to cause me to include people in my study or not include them in my study, and what I'm going to do with the information that people are giving me. Okay, and that's called an informed consent. And typically you have to give it to the person and they have to sign it, and you keep a copy. When you do the sort of work that I do, where you're looking at these closeted behaviors, I usually get a waiver from IRB to have the documentation, but I still have to give my participant the informed consent. Okay. So a big thing I hear out in the public realm, people are like, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a sociologist. They'll say, oh, are you studying me right now? Am I part of a study? Am I part? That's not how it works. If you were part of a study, you would know you were part of a study because you would have gotten informed consent. But this is a problem with Humphrey's work. There's no informed consent. Again, there's no IRB at this point. Today, the IRB would never approve a study like this. And you can see lots and lots of ethical issues with his work. The observing like a voyeur, the invasion of privacy. It's actually illegal to get names and addresses from DMV, posing as someone else, possibly putting the men at risk by talking to them with their wives. So there are lots and lots of concerns with this kind of work. And Humphreys is certainly not the only person in this time period doing this sort of work, but he's one of the more famous. So Humphreys has taken this sociological look at bathrooms. And what he finds is that bathrooms are socially constructed. If you've had me before, you know what social constructionism is. If you don't, I'm going to give you a quick explanation here. Socially constructed means there's no inherent meaning to whatever it is that you're looking at. Okay, the meaning is what the meaning is because we all agree that that's what the meaning is. So a great example of a social construct is money. The paper that our money is printed on does not have any inherent value. The ink used to print 5 on there, 10 or 100 has no inherent value that makes one piece of paper worth more than another piece of paper. Money has value because we all agree that it has value. It's a social construct. Now, thinking about how our society works, yes, okay, money is a social construct, we agree. can I just decide, hey, money's a social construct, I'm not going to use it anymore? Can I go to the store and be like, hey, I want to buy this, and they're like, it's this amount, and I say, hey, you know what, money's a social construct, man, it doesn't mean anything? Is she going to be like, okay, you're right, take whatever this is? No, social constructs still have consequences. It's just they don't have any inherent meaning or truth. They mean what they mean because we agree that they mean what they mean. So, what Humphreys finds is that public bathrooms are socially constructed, and they work in different ways than we might traditionally expect. To most people, it's just a public place to relieve your bladder, but to same sex attracted males in the 70s with no appropriate outlets and all the stigma, it's a tea room. It's a location of sexual autonomy and sexual opportunity. Now, there are all these ethical issues with Humphrey's research, but it has a massive impact anyway. His findings were used in courts and in police policy considerations to alleviate the damaging side effects of covert sexual activity. His work actually helped usher in tolerance as a society. So, despite all these ethical issues with the work, the outcomes of the work were actually very positive. And that's been a big discussion in the field too, is we have all this work that we now realize is like, wow, this is super unethical. What do you do now? The work still has an impact. Do you pretend it doesn't exist because it's so unethical? Do you go ahead and use the work for the greater good? This is an issue. So what makes good research besides being ethical and hopefully IRB approved and all that sort of thing? What makes research good? Good research is going to phrase questions as precisely as possible. Good research knows what it's trying to find out, in part because it has sorted out these research questions precisely. So, for example, is the family beginning to disintegrate as an institution? It gathers factual evidence before drawing conclusions, and it uses the most useful research method to answer the question it's trying to get at. When we're looking at relationship and sexuality behaviors, there tends to be a volunteer bias in the kinds of folks who are going to participate in your sample. So in relationship studies, you're going to find folks who are, they're going to have a tendency to be more educated, higher status jobs, more likely to have lived together. Sexual research, you're going to tend to get volunteers who are younger, more sexually experienced, and more liberal. Now, that's not necessarily good or bad, but it does skew the results that you're getting because your sample has some bias in it. Some volunteer bias, and you can't control who volunteers or doesn't volunteer for your study. Because we rely so heavily on human subjects, we have to be very careful in our approach to ethical concerns. And there are some professional ethics specific to family research. I'm not going to read this slide to you because obviously you can read for yourself. So you want to pause this and go ahead and read over this. There are really two traditions in the research world, the quantitative tradition and the qualitative tradition. And these traditions represent a fundamental debate in the production of knowledge. So the quantitative tradition comes from a theoretical paradigm of positivism. So again, this is the idea there is one truth out there, and if I can just gather enough data about the world, I can know that truth. I can get the true nature of how society operates. By contrast, the qualitative tradition comes from the paradigm of constructivism, this idea that things have meaning because we assess meaning to them. Now, not everything, right? Some things are just the way they are. We have two arms, we have eyes, we age, certain things are what they are, but many, many things in the social world are constructed. That's the assumption of that particular paradigm. The quantitative tradition, the methodologies are large scale. Okay, you're looking at very large sample numbers, 500 people, 1,000 people, thousands of people. Most of your data is going to be gathered through surveys. If you're not in sociology, you might do random control trials, but sociologists we don't run experiments. Excuse me. So most of your stuff is going to probably come from surveys. In the qualitative tradition, your methods are going to be smaller scale, somewhere between 20 and 80, 100 people, somewhere in that neighborhood. Now, there have been qualitative investigations done with large scale interviews, but those are few and far between. Kinsey, for example, interviewed thousands of people, but that's very unusual. You're going to gather your data through interviewing, observation, document analysis, focus groups, things like that. The quantitative tradition, your analysis is going to be statistics. Why? Because all of your data is numerical. So even when people do surveys, their answers are coded with numbers, and you use those numbers to run statistical analysis to figure out what the data is saying. In the qualitative tradition, your data is words, and you're going to use a thematic exploration to try to figure out what the data is saying. Now, both of these traditions give us important information about the issue that we're trying to investigate, but the traditions themselves can be very divisive and very limiting. Typically, when you're talking to a researcher, they'll tell you like, oh, I'm a quant person, oh, I'm a qual person. In an ideal world, we'd all do both traditions because they both tell us different things. Quant work tells us what is happening. Numbers can tell me what is going on, what is the incidence of something, okay? Qualitative work tells me why it's happening. Quant work cannot tell me why something is happening, and qual work can't tell me how many people are doing something. So you need both of these things to really give you a full picture, but it's very rare to find a researcher who does both qual and quant, and there's a very good reason for that. To do quantitative work, you're going to have to be very number oriented. You're going to have to be very mathy, if you will. Most of the time, folks who excel in that are not necessarily great at interviewing people, because that is a skill unto itself as well. If you're a qualitative person, you're probably pretty good at, the humanities types things, English, history, interpersonal skills. Very often, those people are not very good at math. So it's very unusual to find someone who does both things. Most people are mostly one or the other, or all one thing or the other. And many folks find a partner who is not what they are and do work together. So, for example, I'm very qualitative, but I have friends who are quantitative and we do work together. So you see that quite a bit in the field as well. So in the quantitative tradition, there are two ways for me to try to figure out the answer to the question I'm trying to ask. I can either explore someone else's existing data set, or I can generate my own data set, which we would call primary data. More often than not, if I'm a quant person, I'm going to use someone else's data set. And there's a very simple reason as to why this is the case. It is very time consuming to generate my own data set. It takes a very long time. It's often very expensive to do that as well. The problem with using someone else's data set is they may not have asked the exact questions that I needed asked in order for me to figure out the answer to what I'm asking. The data set had a different intention than what my intention is. So that can create methodological issues as well. In the qualitative tradition, we always generate our own data sets. There are no qualitative data sets out there for use by someone else. All the data sets are very specific to whatever the issue was the person was trying to examine. They're really only useful for that particular inquiry. So all qualitative folks have to generate their own data sets through interview, focus groups, etc. Okay, as I mentioned already, the big divide between quantitative and qualitative is what they do. Quantitative research can only answer what and does. So what is happening with this? Does this issue cause people to do that, or are these things correlated or whatever? Qualitative research answers why and how. For example, quantitative research can tell me something like, does reading the How to Write a Research Paper ebook increase the average research papers in a class? How often something happens? How much? Or what is the change over time in a different situation? Okay. Qualitative research can tell me, why is someone doing this or that? So, I find out there's this phenomenon of women who are assumed to be monogamous, who are secretly seeking out same-sex sexual encounters. I can ask, why? Why is that happening? Sometimes people claim to be one or other style because of a preference for a method, but you want to use the correct method for the questions you're asking. So then, thinking back to what we just talked about in the last slide, most of the time people are one style or the other style because of their skill set. But sometimes you want to ask a question that the method for answering that question is not the method you're good at. So I'm qualitative. So if I want to know how many people are doing something or whether something impacts something else, I can only do that through quantitative methods. So I'm going to have to partner up with someone who can help me do that, and vice versa. If they want to know why or how, they're going to have to partner up with me. The methods and techniques in family research include, but are not limited to, surveys, clinical research, field research, secondary analysis, experiments, evaluation research. There are others, but these are some of the more common. 6 common data collection methods in family research. So the methods we just talked about. This table tells you the strengths and limitations of each one. I'm not going to read this to you because you can read to yourself. So go ahead and pause this slide and take a look at these strengths and limits of each one. And what you really should notice from this is all methodologies have strengths and weaknesses. There's no perfect method of gathering data. That just does not exist, just like there are no perfect theoretical explanations of a phenomenon either. When we're trying to analyze family dynamics, we're looking at the family as a system. So the interactions have to be studied in the context of the family system. When we're looking at family, the structure can really only be seen in the interactions between family members. And we have to think about family as a purposeful system with a goal. Despite resistance to change, each family system is transformed over time. Something that complicates family research is the concept of front stage and backstage. Front stage is where the performance is given. This is a concept by Erving Goffman, who's a pretty famous sociologist. So the front stage, so he has this idea that we're all basically playing roles in our lives all the time. Okay, so today I'm playing the role of professor and you're playing the role of student. We may play the role of wife, mother, sibling, worker. So our front stage is the space where we're performing these roles. It's in this region that we engage in and perform our roles for the audience. And the audience is everybody else we encounter. And we're also their audience. And we have this tacit agreement with each other that if one of us were to fall out of our role for a second, or fall out to the performance, we pretend like we don't notice that. The backstage is the place where actors discuss, polish, or refine their performance without revealing themselves to the audience members. Your backstage and your front stage are going to change depending on what you're doing. So let's take my role as a professor. When I'm in my office by myself, that could function as my backstage. But if I'm in my office with another student, my backstage has now become my front stage. Okay? The backstage allows you to express aspects of yourself that your audience might find unacceptable, and you might relax and even drop the act while you're in that backstage. Alongside these ideas are the concept of impression management. This is another concept by Goffman, and it's this idea that I may have goal-directed conscious or subconscious processes and behaviors that are really me attempting to influence the perceptions other people have about me. And I do this by regulating and controlling the information that I'm giving to other people in social interactions. And the clearest example that we can give you to help you understand what impression management is would be if one of us were to go to prison today. So if I were to get arrested and go to prison, I'm not going to act like I act in any other realm of my life. I'm going to sort of put on this other kind of persona or sort of version of myself because I want the other people I'm in prison with to have a certain impression of me. So that's impression management. So, for example, this would represent a family's front stage. Everyone's dressed nicely, they're posed together, they're each playing the roles. Mom, dad, sister, brother. This is very much a front stage performance. Obviously, it's a snapshot of a front stage performance, but it's very much a front stage performance. By contrast, this would certainly be the backstage of a family. Obviously, they're not posing for anyone or putting on any sort of performance. However, even within our backstage with each other, we're still playing these roles. So dad is still playing his role, siblings still playing their roles with each other. Now their audience has just gotten smaller. Your audience is now one another rather than the public. Okay, so even within our backstage, we're often still putting on a performance, just not one that's so polished. The only time we're not really doing that is when we're in our backstage alone. When we're collecting data, we have to make decisions. For example, how to measure the variables that we're interested in, how to collect cases, what kind of data collection techniques. These are just a few of the numerous decisions that have to be made while we're trying to collect data for whatever study it is we're trying to run. The bottom line here is that there are special concerns in researching the family. Everyone assumes themselves to be an expert on family because we all come from a family. So researchers must be careful in their research design and be sure to be ethical in their research practices. But family research dispels myths and tells us where we were and where we're headed.